Hello, Susan. How are you today? You well?
I'm fine, Tom. How are you?
I'm okay too, thank you. Thank you for doing this interview. By the way, that's a really nice backdrop. What are those pictures behind you?
Well, they all have to do somehow with my life. That one with women in gowns is some of the first women at Somerville College, which is the college, as you know, that I attended in Oxford.
Yes.
The middle, small picture, comes from Brighton because I spent some time there at the Ship Hotel doing some workshops, and I loved English deck chairs.
Yes, those very nice.
This picture is of a hydrangea.
A hydrangea? Nice. Okay, so Susan, I'm going to
The hydrangea is one of these beautiful tropical.
That's right. Susan, I'm going to ask you a bit about your life, okay? So let's start with your parents. Did you have a nice,
Yes.
Did you have a nice, happy childhood? Or, looking back, did you feel that it was maybe overshadowed by the fact that your parents had been refugees from Nazi Germany? Maybe as a child you weren't quite aware of it, but maybe looking back, it was overshadowed by that?
The answer is yes, I did have a happy childhood. I felt I was happy. I felt that my parents did the best they could in very troubled times in the 30s in London and in the 40s when we lived outside London to protect us from many things regarding World War II. But they had funny accents, which I didn't like. We had a name which I couldn't pronounce properly in English because I didn't know how to and just tried to swallow it. And we were different. I had dark brown, straight hair, and we just were not like the other English people around us.
Had both your parents come from Berlin, or where had they come from?
Both my parents were real Berliners. They were frankly city people, although like many Germans of their generation, they loved to walk. And my father, even after he came to England in 1933, would continue to go to Switzerland to, quotes, climb mountains. My mother would walk with us during the war where we were living outside London in the countryside. They were both very city people in that my mother loved shopping. She loved going to concerts. And my father, I don't know. He would read in any part of the world. And I don't really know what he did in Germany besides his own research work.
So you had a happy childhood and they shielded you. Of course, you managed to go, you may have felt somehow foreign from your parents, but you managed to go to the most English of institutions. You got a place at Oxford University. And of course, in those days, it was much more unusual and much harder for women to get into Oxford. And also there were less foreign students. I mean, today, there are lots of female students. It's probably 50-50 at Oxford, and there are very many international students. So how was it at Oxford? Did you enjoy it there? How did you find it?
Well, first of all, my parents had the expectation that I would go to Oxford or Cambridge. It was never in doubt from their point of view. And the same expectation was from the public school I went to. There were very few of us, and it was a girls' school, and there was never any question that we would get into either Oxford or Cambridge, and we were groomed to do that, both academically, and I was told by our headmistress how I should dress when I went for interviews in Oxford or Cambridge. Once I got there, it was a whole new world, a world of so many people, so many activities. Yes, there were academics, as we would say today, and we did our work at weird hours in the morning, but it was like a wonderful banquet of everything that you could imagine in life that I had no idea could exist. The college itself was a women's college, and there the restrictions were such that, frankly, I enjoyed going to the other colleges, to the male tutors. They were fun, they were interesting. Our main history tutor didn't even know in 1955 of the existence of long playing records. Wow. And so it went on. However, at the end of our time there, she drove my friend Adrian and I out to churches to do brass rubbing, which I'd never also done in my life. So yes, it was a wonderful time, and I made friends there with a lot of people, including, of course, your father, John Gross, and some of the women I am friends with today, and we are in constant contact every 2 weeks. And last year, when I was in South Africa, I met somebody I had not seen since Oxford in 1956, and he gave us a wonderful time in Cape Town. So those friendships are very valuable, and I suppose what we studied was also important for whatever came afterwards.
Just remind me which subject you studied.
I studied what was called modern history. In other words, it meant everything except classical Greece and Rome. But when I asked as a special subject to study 1918 to 1939, because that meant something rather close to me, I was told, rubbish, my dear, that's not history. So they said, do the period beforehand. And I said, no way, I'm going back to the Italian Renaissance. So I learned Italian, went to Italy and studied the Italian Renaissance, not knowing at the time that the Italian Renaissance had more wars than any other period in history.
What wasn't just beautiful art.
But it was,
yeah, sorry.
It wasn't just art history. And I had, it was much more than that, but we had to read in Italian, Guicciardini and Vasari and so on. And I spent the summer in Italy and then wandered around the country afterwards.
How wonderful. So I know that after Oxford, you went on a trip to America in, I think it was 1959. And actually, I think initially you were visiting, partly there, visiting my father, who was on a fellowship to Princeton after Oxford. But your trip to America turned into a sort of half a lifetime there. So tell me how you found America when you first arrived. Did you feel somehow better or more comfortable than England, or how did it differ?
Well, a couple of things. One, yes, I did go to America in the summer of 1959, but with the intention of staying a year to get a degree in psychology, because I intended to come back to England, to London, to the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. And since I had no background in psychology, that's why one of the reasons I went to America. New York was another world. It was the first time in my life I heard Yiddish. It was the first time in my life I felt Jews were like, if not a majority, they counted as people, which was not true for me in England. It was exciting. There were foods there that I had never eaten before. To go to the Lower East Side and have lunch in a Jewish deli and then wander over to Chinatown for Chinese food just a short distance away. It was amazing. It was a wonderful experience. You could go to the opera, you couldn't get a ticket, but you knew for the last act that the old people would leave, so you'd get the best seats in the house for the last act of an opera. It was a very exciting time. It was yeah. Wonderful.
But then you ended up staying in America for longer, and that's because you met your husband, I guess.
I met my husband, whose who's Portuguese, and we went to live in Lisbon. He was intending to continue his career there, which came to nothing. But what was important in Lisbon was my son was born there, and I managed to get us out of Lisbon within a year because I had taken a green card to go to America since I knew I had to work there and I couldn't just study and enjoy myself. So returning to New York was really then a permanent choice, although I don't think I knew it at the time, and I didn't know what I was going to do with my life in any case. We had gone to university, and the year before I went, there was a book published called Wives Who Went to College.
Mm-hmm.
So that was all we were intended to be there for, to be wives of people who had careers and so on. Back in America, I had to work. We had no money. We lived in New Jersey in a rental apartment, and I began working and on the Lower East Side in research projects and realized I can do this too. These are people with doctorates, but why can't I do the same kind of work? So from the beginning, and by then I had a second child as well, I felt that I could do something and it could be in America. I didn't realize at that time how strong the sexism still was. Mm-hmm. I was told when I applied in New York still for a PhD, well, you've already got one child, how do we know you won't have another? In fact, I was already pregnant. But going to Chicago a few years later in 1967 was somehow easier. I got accepted and I got a scholarship to the University of Chicago. The only problem is we lived 35 miles away from the university in the suburbs. I'd never lived in the suburb before. I had looked at houses around the university, but then I saw that the front door had 9 or 10 locks. Mm-hmm. And I said, no way can I have my young children live in that kind of environment. So I continued to commute to the University of Chicago, and they lived outside in the suburbs and went to school there and had their childhoods in a great deal of peace. I endured the '67 riots at the University of Chicago, but I always had to run back home. Even in the evenings when I had coursework, my former husband wouldn't babysit, so I had to find babysitters. It was not easy. And I was told by the university at one point, look, you have 2 children, you've done enough. You've done everything except write the dissertation. Why don't you give up? So that was the kind of message that got to me. So I was more determined than ever. By the time I actually finished University of Chicago, I was already at Northwestern for 2 years. So everything was possible, but it was a fight. It was never easy.
No, I'm sure. I mean, look, you know, 60s was the time that feminism was kind of beginning, but as you say, until today, there's still a lot of sexism in America and many places. And also until today, although Chicago has its charms, I believe it's the murder capital of America. Until today, it's not the safest city. And in fact, my first time in Chicago was when I met you with my father in the early 1980s. My father then working for the New York Times and living in New York. And I traveled with him to Chicago. I remember meeting with you, or we went to some nice restaurant or maybe a jazz club or something. And then actually—
we went to something called the Sardine Club.
The Sardine Club. You've got a better memory than me. And actually, funnily enough, although my father's a great man of books and a great intellectual, he very much wanted to see Las Vegas. So I went on to Las Vegas with him. We stayed at the Stardust Hotel. But I distinctly remember how nice it was to meet you. And also my father was very happy to see you again. And that was the purpose of our visit to Chicago. And it was a nice one. So Susan, later on, in the end of the 1980s, you make another move. You cross the world and moved to Israel, because I think you met your future husband Louis, so that's why you went. So how was it moving to Israel? I mean, did you know the country? Had you visited as a tourist before? And how did you find it?
I'd never been to Israel. The first time was then in 1988. And how I got there was also interesting. I was high up in the administration at the university, and one of the deans came to me one day, a couple of years earlier, before I went to Israel, saying, "Susan, I'd like to nominate you to be on the board of the American Jewish Committee in Chicago." I said, "Who, me?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "I don't want anything to do with religion. If it's to do with intercultural activities or ethics, fine." He said, "Yeah." Anyway, we did it. And one of my most memorable Passovers was, in fact, on the South Side with a group of Black parishioners. And we shared the story of Passover, which was really quite a moving time. And then a couple of years later, after I'd been on the board, I was told, "We've nominated you for an all expenses trip to Israel this Christmas." I said, "What?" It was October 1987. I said, "I can't go at Christmas. My children come home at Christmas." My children were then, of course, in their 20s. They were no longer children. In any case, I finally went to Israel in 1988. It was meant to be a roots trip, and it was meant to show the other academics and academic administrators who were on that group what Israel was like. And somehow I was less interested in the past, in what had been in the shtetls and so on, but I was fascinated by multicultural Israel, by the fact that people from all over the world were moving there, and they were all Jews. I'd only met Jews in England or America. So it was very exciting. True, I met Louis on that trip, and we toured the Golan, and he told these incredible stories of military prowess of Israel in 1967.
Louis, just to remind, he had been in the army. He'd been in the army as a kind of career.
He was in the reserve army in the spokesman's unit, yes. And he used to take around senators and congressmen. And then one time they said, "Are you going to take this group of American academics because someone else has dropped out?" So one of these lucky events.
Interesting. I also remember, you know, if you grow up Jewish in London or in America, you tend to think that all Jews come from Central or Eastern Europe. And of course, about half the population of Israel comes from Middle East. They're Middle Eastern Jews from North Africa or Iraq or Yemen, or even further afield from India or Ethiopia. So it is certainly a kind of eye-opener, a good one, I agree with you, that the Jewish people are much more, let's say, dynamic, a much bigger range of Jews from different backgrounds than, not all Jews are from Germany or Poland or Russia. So anyway, you ended up marrying Louis, who you met on that trip, and you ended up moving to Israel. So did you, did you enjoy your years there, or there were ups and downs, or what were your main impressions?
I think it's wonderful that I lived there. I'm very glad I didn't go there when I was young. I mean, my parents were not Zionists. I had a marvelous opportunity to learn about different peoples who made up Israel. And I learned about what a young country could do and how it had built itself up. But I also continued the kinds of learnings and actions that I did in America. In America, it was working with minority communities and their, quote, civil rights. In Israel, it was much more working with human rights. And I found myself working on behalf of human rights for most of the 22 years that I was in Israel. Although I had started off in the university, there was no understanding what an academic administrator could do in those days. So I found other things to do. And the friends I have in Israel are those friends that are friends till today.
That's wonderful. And I remember visiting you also when you moved to Jaffa, which is, of course, a mixed Arab Jewish town south of Tel Aviv. And of course, also you learned in Israel not just about the Jewish world and the Jews, you also learned about the Arab world, not just Palestinian or Bedouins, but also you bought a holiday home, a riad in Marrakesh in Morocco. So Israel opened your eyes not just to the wider Jewish world, but also to the wider Arab world, if I can put it like that.
Yes, that's been very special learning for me. And also it emphasizes again how narrow were our studies in Oxford. Maybe it's different today. We learned Western European history with Western eyes, and I had little notion of what kinds of cultures existed elsewhere. And what is marvelous is to continue those learnings. And yes, you're quite right, Israel started that. And having a home in Marrakesh for nearly 20 years, of course, emphasized that even more. It was very exciting, and I've been very lucky to be involved in those different worlds as well, and accepted too.
I mean, by the way, I'm younger than you, but I also went to Oxford, and I share your impression that, you know, I had a very good education at Westminster School in Oxford, and yet looking back, it was remarkably narrow. And, you know, I shared the same eye-opening experience as you, and I'm somewhat younger than you. So I don't know whether it's changed today, maybe a little bit, but I doubt whether it's changed that much. Anyway, then if we fast forward, in 2012, you in a way come full circle, and you moved to the city where your parents had escaped from, Berlin. Now, of course, Berlin in 2012 is very different than Berlin that they escaped from with the rise of fascism in the 1930s. And I mean, I also have an interest in Berlin. As you know, my grandmother also escaped from Berlin to what was then Palestine from Hitler in the 30s, and one of my grandfather was also from a nearby town in Germany, and so on. So I also have personally mixed feelings about Berlin. I have influences on me through my mother and grandparents of German secular German Jewish culture, and yet of course one cannot escape history. So how does it feel, you know, to be living as a, let's say, a secular Jew in Berlin today? And is that feeling the same now in the year 2020 as it was in 2012 when you decided to move there?
Well, first of all, when Louis suggested moving to Berlin, I said, no way, how can I live there? But I'd said the same thing in 2002 when we were invited by friends to come and visit Berlin. I said, I'm not going. And he said, if you can't take it, we'll come back to Israel the next day. Well, since 2002, we'd been becoming regularly. 2012, when we came, there were a lot of Israelis already, young Israelis. And people said, people like you don't come to Berlin. I said, I know. We were immediately welcomed by a large circle of people who were interested in hearing our story, particularly my story, which frankly I had never investigated before. But in order to bring out about some kind of reconciliation with coming to live in Berlin, where most of my family had been murdered, either in Germany or in countries surrounding it, in concentration camps, was very difficult for me. And what I did was I concentrated on the nearest relative, my father's father, whom I called Opalin, the grandfather from Berlin, because he had come twice to England after my parents had gone there in 1933, once before I was born, once after I was born. And my father died in 1986, not knowing how or when his father had died. So I felt I owed something to my father. Once the Berlin Wall came down, everything became much easier to find out about. So I had been to Theresienstadt, and I began spending a lot of time in the archives in Berlin, where every scrap of paper from the 20s and 30s is kept. I found my grandfather's letters. I found my father's handwriting in trying to get the building that was taken from his father. Everything was there. And in the end, we laid what's called a Stolperstein, a stumbling stone of brass put into the pavement in Berlin for my grandfather. And it was done together with the head of the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, whose community house happened to be across from my grandfather's. So there became another ecumenical relationship and friendship across borders, if you like. And the people whom I met then are still friends today. Interestingly enough, and we are taping this well into the COVID-19 crisis. On the 15th of March, Louis and I were going to hold an 8 years in Berlin party. And this was for friends we'd made here. 30 people were invited. And to show them, look, it's all right for us. Yes, there's anti-Semitism. There's also a lot of Islamophobia. We have felt nothing. I don't feel any different about living in Berlin today than I did in coming here in 2012. I think we have to be cautious, we have to be open, and we have to go on educating people as to what did happen so that people understand that the other is not different from you or me. And there needs to be respect all around for other religions, races, cultures, the kinds of things you and I found Oxford did not necessarily offer us.
And I know you've been giving some talks to local school children and so on, and playing a very important role in that. So Susan, thank you very much. That's a really fascinating, wonderful life you're still having. You may be a little bit older than some of the Israelis in their 20s.
I'm sure.
No, but you're young at heart. At heart, you're definitely as young as them. So Susan, thank you very much. And it's been fascinating. Okay.
You're welcome. Thank you. I've enjoyed it. Bye.